Well, this is such a treat to be. I think the last time I was at City Hall in PG, Alex, what was this is my best friend from when I was 4. Right back there, we went to Robert Down. What was the movie about the big dog that they filmed down here? Yeah, that was the last time I was here. So anyway. So yeah, is this mic not working? No. Okay. Is it working now? No. All right. Well, then I'll just yell. How about that? All right. So, good evening. Thank you for being here. My name is Ben Jealous. I lived in PG from 4 to 17. My parents still live here. I was thanking my buddies from my block for forgiving me for having spent the first 4 years of my life in Carmel. It's still kind of a thing over here. I'm joined up here by our esteemed former Congressman Sam Farr. I won't say that I learned everything that it took to win the Democratic primary for governor in Maryland on your first campaign, Sam, but I did learn how to hang a door knocker. And that has served me well ever since. Sam's been in my life since I was a kid. And somebody who's been my hero since I was young, too, is Mel Mason, founder of the Village Project. And I'm eager to get into conversation with them and with you, but I thought I'd start with a story and then read a couple of pages, and then we can kind of get into it. So it starts in my book, early in my book, in chapter 2. Starts with me not 2 miles from here, down on Cannery Row. And the fancy hotel down at the end of Cannery Row, closest to Monterey, was the site for a Renaissance weekend. Now, not the type of Renaissance weekend that has like knights and damsels in distress. No, this was the Clintons' group of friends. Before the Clinton Global Initiative, they had Renaissance weekend. And Bill and Hillary are true workaholics. They thought it was a great idea to get all their friends together every single holiday weekend somewhere in this country to discuss how to save the world. And I've been invited for several years, and it always seemed expensive and like there was something better to do on a holiday weekend, like nothing. But then I saw it was in Monterey, and I said, I should go. I could stay at my parents' house. It's free. And at this Renaissance weekend, the night ended the same each of the 3 or 4 nights. There were cocktails, and then there was dinner. New set of people every night you would sit with. And this night was probably the last night. And it seemed like there's just a lot of alcohol that night and like no food. And so I was probably, a glass of wine too far before dinner began that night. And while we were waiting for the food, I was looking at my table. And the most interesting couple sitting to the right of me was interesting because she appeared to be 15 years older than him. And my grandmother, who lived in Canterbury Woods and passed last August, my hero in many ways, my greatest hero, she had worked for Planned Parenthood in 1940. And she was always, talk to you like she had worked for Planned Parenthood in 1940. And she said, I only made one mistake. I did not marry a man 15 years my junior. That was my grandma. But it looks like this lady had. So I said, where y'all from? Like, where'd y'all grow up? He said, we're from Los Gatos. I said, I'm from here. Ain't nobody really from Los Gatos. He looked like he was like 65. She was 80. I said, where y'all from? He said, I'm from Minnesota, and my wife is from Virginia. I said, where? Where in Virginia? He said, Southern Virginia. I said, Where in Southern Virginia? He said, Petersburg. I said, Petersburg? I said, my mama's family's from Petersburg. I said, what are her family names? He said, well, her maiden name is Bland. Now, my family, and I think part of what prepared my mom to marry a guy with the last name Jealous is that her mom's maiden name was Bland. And I think most people would rather be jealous than bland. So we got a lot of adjectives in the family. So he says, yeah, my wife's maiden name is Bland. I said, wait, what? What's your wife's name? He said, her name is Maggie Bland. I said, oh. So my grandma's from Petersburg. Her name is Mamie Bland. And he's from Minnesota. He was not prepared for what came next. I said, sir, I'm not sure how to put this. This is me like 2 whiskeys and a glass of wine in. I said, sir, I'm not sure how to put this, but I'm pretty sure your wife's family used to own my mama's family. He was from Minnesota, so they switched seats very quickly. The intimacies, the realities of slavery, he did not want to get. You know, I used to joke that our family was black and the Jeffersonian model of blackness until I figured out we descended from his grandma. And then it was just a description, it wasn't a joke. And so he switched seats, and now I have this 80-year-old white woman up in my face. She's right up next to me. Come here, baby, give me a kiss. Publisher changed it to hug, whatever. I always knew I had black family. How'd you know that you had black family? Oh, because when Mammy would get on the party line with my mother and her sisters because they were squabbling, first of all, she said Mammy. She didn't say my Mammy like I thought a rich kid might say my nanny. She just said Mammy like Mommy. So when Mammy would get on the party line with my mom and her sisters got to squabbling, she could squash any fight in 15 seconds flat. She said, in the Bland family, only blood can do that. And then she explained that Mammy had been sent away without any warning one day while she was at school when she was 12 years old. When her mom hadn't taken much interest in her, was 54. She was an unexpected blessing at 42. And her older brothers, who were almost a generation older than her, well, they had fought with swords till they drew blood because one was offended, the other had brought the biography of Abraham Lincoln into their house in San Francisco. And so she didn't feel like she fit in with her brothers. She was pretty sure that Mammy was her kin, and Mammy was the only mommy that she really had. And she'd been looking for a black family ever since. So that's the setup for what I'm about to read to you now. When I approached my grandma, nay, Mamie Bland, about the prospect of meeting our likely cousin, nay, Maggie Bland, my grandma shrugged. That's okay, baby. I knew those people when I was young. I have no interest in reconnecting with them. I explained that Maggie was different, that she was born in California and had been a hippie. I shared that she was raised for her first 12 years by a black woman who she believed her cousin. Maggie was eager to reconnect with more black members of her family. In fact, she had been looking for us her entire life. My grandma said she'd think about it. She said no. I'd die happy if I never saw them. To say she knew them was an understatement. She was born a black Bland in Dinwiddie County, where many of the most prominent blacks and whites shared that unfortunate adjective as their family name. Moreover, her great-grandfather, Frederick Bland, was the only slave mentioned in the will of Richard Yates R.Y. Bland, who owned Fred, his wife, née Nancy Yates, and their children. It is my will and desire that my body servant Frederick be kept in the family where my sons may live, to wait on them and attend to home business, gardening, and so for him to make his board, if no more. He is never to work out as a field hand nor under an overseer. R.Y. Bland had many slaves, but only one was mentioned in the will. And every word of the mention was dedicated to protecting said slave. Why? Well, when the Harvard University historian Henry Louis Skip Gates pored over the will and other assembled evidence, his conclusion was concise. R.Y. Bland knew Fred was his older brother and wanted to protect him. It was clear the sudden appearance of a white cousin unsettled my grandmother in ways for which she was not prepared. Then she said yes. On some level, she wanted the healing that Cousin Maggie was looking forward to. They met. It was brief. The family resemblance was clear. A loop had been connected. I thought that was it. And then one day, my phone rang. Hey, Cousin Ben. Oh, Cousin Maggie, what can I do you for? Cousin Ben, you run a foundation, don't you? Yes, I do. Well, I need help. Hurricane Katrina has caused a real mess, and we all need help. Hurricane Katrina had rolled through New Orleans just 2 days before. The country was abuzz with concern. Everyone was trying to help however they could. Cousin Maggie continued, I have a family from the lower Ninth Ward who are in an especially urgent situation. I had the unfortunate task of explaining to my newfound cousin that there was nothing my foundation could do. By charter, we only funded in California, and we only funded civil rights advocacy. Direct aid to individuals in Louisiana was way out of our territory. Well, just listen to me, she insisted. All right, cousin, hit me. I have these two boys. They're in a nursing home up in Baton Rouge, in the hallway. They were sent there after they were rescued from their family home in the lower Ninth Ward. The parents owned a family-run printing business, but the floodwaters came in and destroyed everything. The boys had to be rushed out right away. One is in an iron lung and the other one probably should be. Now they're in this nursing home hallway in Baton Rouge. And although the nursing home is far from the flood zone, it's been inundated with wind and rain. The mold is building up. The spores are floating in the air. If they get in those boys' lungs, they could both die in a matter of days. As Maggie talked, I remembered that my godbrother, the comedian Dave Chappelle, had called the day before to ask me to keep an ear to the ground for any individuals who needed help. My imam said to give alms to any individual who asks, he said. I didn't expect any to find me, quite honestly, in San Francisco. I hadn't really given it another thought. But now, here was my cousin, Maggie Bland, descendant of the men who owned my family, descendant of the men who raped my great-great-grandmothers and their mothers. She was asking me for help. I called Dave and explained that Maggie needed an air ambulance to get the boys from Louisiana to California. Absolutely, Dave said. Call my accountant and give her the information. I called right away. The funds were wired. The two boys in the nursing home were airlifted out to Sacramento and given a new home. Their family was able to rebuild their lives. Maggie was elated and went back to working on the issues of the day in California. A few weeks later, Dave and I were on the phone. I was the closest thing to a lawyer in the family, and he would often call when there was a difficult situation to work through. While we were talking, he excused himself. FedEx was at the door. It reminded me that I had an unopened FedEx envelope that arrived that morning. I reached for it. It was from Sacramento. Dave, I said, where's your FedEx from? It's from Sacramento, he said. I think it's that family. Yeah, I've got one here too. Let's open it. I heard the envelope rip on his side of the phone before I ripped open mine. Dave slid out a photograph as I slid out mine. He was quiet. I was quiet. Ben, did you know the family was white? Dave, I had no idea, man. Maggie said they lived in the lower 9th Ward. I assumed they were black. Yeah, me too. It was a large photograph. We each pulled it all the way out of the envelope and turned it over and read the inscription on the back. Thank you, Ben. God bless you, the Goldman family. Ben. Did you know they were Jewish? Dave, I didn't know they were white. Never occurred to me they might be Jewish. Well, the Lord definitely works in mysterious ways. Do me a favor, brother. Don't tell anybody about this for a while. Sure, Dave, why not? I have no idea how to explain it at the mosque this week. I paused and I said, Dave, just tell them this is exactly how America is supposed to work. Only in America could the former slaveholding side of the family call the formerly enslaved side of the family in order to get alms from a black Muslim to get some poor white Jews out of the lower ninth. You might ask the pastor, what's the sermon in a sentence? That's the book in a few pages. And what this book comes from, and then I'll sit down and we'll get into the conversation, but this book comes from a place of having lived on a bridge between the East Coast and the West Coast, school years here and most of each summer in West Baltimore and West Cape May. Two different black communities. Bridge between black and white. My parents' marriage had been against the law in 1966. That's how we got here, ultimately. And a bridge between North and South. On my mom's bloodline, I'm the first son born outside the South, although I was baptized there. And on my dad's side, I'm the first of the bloodline born outside of New England. And that's going back about 400 years on either side. And so when you grow up on a bridge like that, what you figure out is we have way more in common than we think we do. There's a lot of painful parts of this book. I get into the toll that deindustrialization has taken on black folks and white folks, and it's very similar. I get into the fact that we have twice as many poor white people in America as poor black people, but if you ever looked at a newspaper, you wouldn't believe it. Get into the fact that by like a factor of more than 4, there are more, when it comes to handgun deaths, there are more than 4 times as many caskets filled with white men who died of suicide than there are black men who died of homicide. And we don't talk about it. I was on a podcast in Baltimore County with a white guy, he's a friend of mine, former county exec out there, and he started counting while I was talking. He's like, 1, 2, 3, 4. I was like, wait, did I cuss that many times? And he said, no, sorry, leave PG, you go learn to organize in Harlem. You're never quite the same when it comes to cussing. But he said, no, Ben. He said, 6 of my family and friends, the men, over 50, have committed suicide, including my father. And he said, I never thought of it as a trend because nobody talks about it. There's so much shame. And the media, you're right, has never said anything about it. I thought it was just our family. I thought it was a plague on us. But when I was probably 12 when a white step-cousin tried to commit suicide. I think I was probably about 9, Alex, when our friend's dad up the street committed suicide. And I was, when I became president of the NAACP at 35, one of my cousins was shot and killed about 5 miles from the office. So you grow up on this bridge, and you're like, no, we have way more in common, even things we don't think we have in common. Handgun violence, that's a black issue. Well, I can tell you, when your dad kills himself, it's happened to my 2 best friends, 2 of our crew of boys, rather, on Gibson Avenue. It's pretty damn violent. And so my hope is if this changes this country in any way, it's this. It's to get people who think to get people to practice the golden rule with courage. To practice the golden rule with courage, which is to say, to remember that your neighbor includes the person you think you have nothing in common with. COVID was a great opportunity for this for me, because I'm the former Democratic nominee for governor who lives on a street that has got to be like 98% Trump supporters. And not just going by the flags. And it turns out, I mean, I now have a whole bunch of friends because we all got new dogs. Living where we live, we all drive trucks. We all have boats. We all drink brown liquor. And, you know, you get all that together and we can help each other solve our romantic problems as well. So, but it was that attitude, Mel was a former Black Panther, as I get into the book, that frankly fueled all of the leaders in the Black community who were sort of assassinated in the worst ways, if you will. The biggest ones and the worst. The biggest, Martin Luther King is assassinated not when he's leading desegregation battles. He's desegregated when he announces he's leading a poor people's campaign to unite the white poor and the Black poor. Malcolm X is assassinated not when he's a rabid Black nationalist, but when he comes back from Mecca and says that the organizing must happen across racial lines. In the Black Panther Party, there were a lot of folks assassinated, but the one whose assassination was the most militaristic, the most premeditated, the most thorough was Fred Hampton, the first person to coin the phrase Rainbow Coalition, and to command his lieutenants to go form alliances and friendships with the white patriots, who were also sons of the South, moved to the North, parents in the factories shutting down, boys being sent to Vietnam, and every group in between. And the NAACP, of all of our presidents who were killed, the one whose assassination was so thorough they did not even find a tooth was Harry Moore. It's Christmas Day, I think 1951, right around there. Harry and Harriet, Christmas Eve, Christmas morning, Christmas dinner, put the kids to bed on the second floor of their ranch house, go to bed on the first floor in a different wing. Klan sneaks under the bedroom, packs it with dynamite. When they were done, they couldn't even find a tooth. Harry Moore is remembered as the president of the NAACP of Florida, the one who led a 1 million person voter registration drive in the era of the poll tax 15 years before the Voting Rights Act. But they often fail to mention he was also president of the Florida Progressive Party, seeking to organize working white folks and working Black folks into a single coalition. And what I've found in my life is that when I've permitted myself to sit down with the likes of Newt Gingrich or Grover Norquist or Jack Kemp or Colin Powell or any number of folks who I knew I disagreed with something a lot on, we figured out we had a lot in common, and we got big things done. Maybe the most surprising part of this book is that the only governors I praised in it were all Republicans who showed courage. When I went to them, as somebody who had taken an interest in them, not just for what they might do for me, but who they were, and asked them to have courage on something related to ending mass incarceration. So let's have a conversation. Thank you guys for being here.
First of all, Ben, this is it's an incredible book. This is incredible. You know, it's and I think I read it twice. I'll probably read it again. There's so much in here, especially around common interest leading to the common good. One of the keystones of coalition building is that I was frankly taken aback when I saw that your relative had united with this guy Mahone, who was a Confederate general who had then become an industrialist, I think, after the Civil War. That he had actually mowed down, I think, as you pointed out in the book, in a battle that he actually had, he and his group had actually won against the Union Army. When the black soldiers who were part of that, actually put their hands up and gave up, he massacred them. And so my first thought was, boy, would I like to catch you with your hands up. But anyway, I'm not here to advocate anything other than peace and love. To see.
But there are emotions that come up sometimes.
Right, absolutely. But then later on, this same guy is then met with, talked with, and everything by a relative of yours. It's Bland.
Bland, yeah. Fred.
And because he was able to not look in the back, look in the past, but to look ahead, actually. What is going to get us to where we need to be? And what is it that this guy has, or how can this guy be used as a resource for making that happen? I would certainly have to get out of my mind the picture of black soldiers being massacred by this guy. And for him to be able to do that and stuff is a real credit to him, because he was able to look beyond his own feelings and to look at what is going to be best for all of the people, who look like him. All the people who were of African ancestry. And so he was able to utilize that. I think they actually found it, and then the readjusters.
I'll kind of tell you. So what Mel is talking about is, and this is maybe the most surprising part in the book, after figuring out that we were cousins to Robert E. Lee, which really messed me up. Literally the most country Republican legislator in Maryland, when I told him that. This is the guy who refers to himself as Cornbread. When I told Delegate Cornbread that I was cousins to Robert E. Lee, he goes, man, I wouldn't want to be related to him. And I was like, wow. So, but was figuring out my mom's great-grandfather's involvement in something called the Readjuster Party. Raise your hand if anybody ever taught you that there was a moment, like an epic of American history, when former Confederate soldiers by the droves and former formerly enslaved black men by the droves joined a third party and took over multiple state governments. Yeah. That book, that book for children called When Johnny Reb and the Freedmen Took Over State Governments. Yeah, I never saw that one too. But that's what happened. In Virginia, Reconstruction was over. Reconstruction ends in America in 1876. That's the 10 years of sort of peace and love, if you will, after the Civil War in the South. With a compromise signed by a president who legitimacy was being protested. The South said they would secede again, and so Rutherford B. Hayes gave the South basically everything they wanted short of secession. And part of that was sending black soldiers out here. Every black in the South was removed, typically sent out west to the so-called Buffalo Soldiers. And the federal installments in the South were all like the heavy artillery, most of the guns were removed. And that unleashed the terror of the Ku Klux Klan. And it also, the former Confederates were all reenfranchised. And the old oligarchs, the plantation owners, they assumed everything would go back to the way it was. And so they said, well, given this high Civil War debt, we're just going to have to shut down the free public schools without thinking about how many white people were sending their kids to the free public schools that the Reconstruction government had started. And this was 15 years after the war, so kids had gone all the way to, through 12th grade, some instances. It's a big deal. And so white men fled. The conservative party of the day was the Democratic Party. White men fled the Democratic Party, formed their own party called the Readjusters. Former Confederate General William B. Mahone, turned railroad magnate, industrialist indeed, did something that the other railroad magnates weren't doing. He decided to join the rebellion. He said, yeah, but my railroad's a Southern railroad, and if we're going to get the money we need out of the Union-run government, we need a mass movement. And so he said, I'm not going to put down my workers' rebellion, I'm going to join it. He was first a class traitor for that move. And then my grandmother's grandfather, my mom's great-grandfather, the son of Fred Bland, Edward David Bland, who had walked out of his uncle's house to freedom at 17, was now about 35, and he, 32 I guess, and he approaches former Confederate General William B. Mahone, turned head of the Readjuster Party, whose name came from their demand, readjust the Civil War debt so we can keep our public schools, and said, we are the ones who created those schools. We want them too. We want to join your party. And then he led blacks out of the Republican Party into the Readjuster Party, and when the dust settled, they had taken over the Virginia legislature, both houses, the governorship, both U.S. senators, because they had a party that was massive. It was now a majority black party led by a former Confederate general and a freedman. And what is the legacy of that party? Well, they saved the free public schools. They radically expanded Virginia Tech, making it the working person's rival to UVA. They created what is now Virginia State University, started then as the first publicly funded institution of higher learning for the express purpose of training black teachers. They quadrupled the number of black teachers in 4 years. They abolished the public whipping post. They abolished the poll tax. They raised taxes on corporations and took the state from a deficit into a surplus. They planted the seeds for the New Deal. General Mahone's and Delegate Bland's lieutenants, young lieutenants, were FDR's old lieutenants in Virginia. And, you know, one of the things, Mel, that kind of blew my mind, because, you know, there's things that they teach you, and then there's what is actually true, right? So they teach you it was slavery, it was Reconstruction, it was Jim Crow. No, there was this inconvenient 10 years in the middle where all over the country, former Confederate soldiers and freedmen were banding together, taking over city governments, county governments, state governments. That makes the narrative of Jim Crow really messy. So they just didn't teach it. That's what DeSantis is doing in Florida now. That's what the governor of Virginia is doing as well. First they used the military to put down rebellions of blacks and whites rising up in the 1600s, didn't quite work. In the 1700s they used new laws. That didn't quite work. Then they created a whole new meaning for the word race around 1720. You ever heard anybody ever say, we Irish are a mighty race? They're using the ancient definition of race from about 1100 and change to 1700 and change. But the new definition starting then was there are multiple human races. There are multiple, now I get that, you know, there's 49% of me that's English, so I feel like just lean on dad's side of the family over there. I can safely say that the English imagination seems prone to believing there are multiple types of humanoids, because I saw The Hobbit. But this notion that there are multiple human races is ridiculous on its face, because people like me ever since then have been called mulattoes, the theory that we were like mules, the children of two different species. But you know, a mule can't have a baby. I have two. And Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings had a whole lot more than that. Right. And so when I looked at that now, and I saw that part, Sam, about them abolishing the poll tax. Yeah. And I said, let me go back and look at the numbers in the poll tax. So right after this, you know, they rule for 4 years. In Virginia, there's a new gubernatorial election every 4 years. There's a term limit of 1. They lose everything 4 years later. Disinformation, white supremacist violence, multiple folks are killed. And right away, the poll tax is put back in place, and then about a decade after that, it's put into the state constitution. When the poll tax was imposed in Virginia, it disenfranchised 80% of the blacks and 50% of the whites, and 100% of the members of the Readjuster Party. They outlawed the whole damn thing because it would have been the poor half of white folks and almost all the black folks.
And I certainly want to give my buddy Sam some time here, but when you mentioned you part English, so am I.
You know, I'm way more proud of the 20% that's African, the 20% that's Irish, than I am the 50% that's English, but that's kind of an English
But
thing.
that's part of it, and it's part of me. I never liked it, but that's a fact. And what happened was I was fortunate. I was born in Kentucky, and we came out here in 1956 when I was 13. My mom and I. But growing up in Kentucky, you know, I was a product of enslavement. Not that I was enslaved, but my ancestors were. And so I'm part Cherokee, and I'm also, you know, mainly black, of African ancestry. But what happened with these different other two types of blood that I have is that my great-great-grandmother, who I just found out not too long ago that her name was Mira, was a Cherokee girl who was kidnapped from a Cherokee village in North Carolina and put into slavery. Okay, so there were two states that kidnapped young Cherokee were put into slavery. One was Tennessee, the other one was Kentucky. She was put into slavery in Kentucky. She then married what I was told by my great-grandmother, a full-blooded African man who was also enslaved. And so they had my great-grandmother, who was half Cherokee and half African. And I knew her. I was fortunate. I was 4 years old when she came to live with us. I was afraid of her because I was a kid. She was blind, but she could walk around and knew where everything was, and everything like that. So I thought she was a witch. Maybe she was a good one. But one of the things that happened in slavery was the slave masters, you know, raping black women, slave women. And so as a result of that, this old slave master named Ambrose Bullfolk, and that's the name that my family has on my mom's side. Then she had a kid, a baby, who was half white and half black. You know, that was my great-grandfather, Albert. So my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother married, and then there came all of us. But the one thing that she used to do was to make me sit down by a rocking chair, and I did it because I was scared. And then she would talk to me about slavery. And so one of the things that she took pride in was that, as she would tell me, Melvin, I was a terrible slave. I never did anything anybody told me to do. And when they tried to whip her, she would try to take the whip away from the overseers and whip them with it. It got to the point where the slave master had said if somebody couldn't tame this girl down, he was going to have her killed. So she said the way that she calmed down a little bit was that the slave master had her and her mother walk in sub-zero weather in the snow until their feet burst open. And so she said that when she saw her mother in that kind of pain, she calmed down, I think she said, a little. Not all the way. My great-grandfather, because he was the slave master's son, in one of these contradictory things that happens in slavery like that, he didn't work in the field, and he never got whipped. You know, my great-grandmother got whipped a lot, and also tried to whip people. But he was also allowed to learn how to read and write. So after the Civil War, he and my great-grandmother were married. The slave master, in whatever the contradiction was within him, actually gave my great-grandfather a whole lot of property. So when I was a kid, I used to grow up, I used to run around in what we call the old home place. He had forest, trees for miles. That was their property. And so he and my great-grandmother built a house, just the two of them. And so one day, my great-grandmother was saying, well, she was out on the porch sweeping. And so the night riders, i.e. the Ku Klux Klan, rolled up. And she said that she was out there sweeping, and so one guy pulls up, there's about 20 of them, and he says, nigger woman, get off this property right now. And she said that she told them, gosh, she said, I was wondering when you all were gonna come. She said, so I have a little something for y'all, and it's just right inside the door here, and I'll go get it right now. She pulled out, it was a 16 gauge double barrel shotgun. And so she said that she aimed it at the guy that was talking. And the guy laughed, she said, and said, well, oh, nigger woman, do you think you can kill all of us? There's about 20 of us here. She goes, oh, no. She said, but I do think I can kill you. And she said, the guy, he said, told me, Melvin, I don't think that man was ready to die. So they took off. But that was the kind of spirit that was in my great-grandmother. They also created a school. And this was one of the first schools that taught children of former slaves in Kentucky. It's in Kentucky Archives. It's called the Woolfolk School. And so their oldest son, one of my great uncles, became the headmaster, and then he also then became later the superintendent of what they called the colored schools in Western Kentucky. But the big thing for me was that I had my grandmother for 4 years. I was 4, she was 96. When I turned 8, she turned 100, and then she passed away. By that time, I was no longer afraid of her. I didn't think she was a witch. I thought she was somebody that I dearly, dearly loved, and as I got older, really, really appreciated. The first time that I heard the names of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner, who was her real hero, I think for some obvious reasons, and John Brown. And she said that she didn't like white people, except she would have really loved John Brown, you know. And so I learned about all of these folks from her. Woolfolk, when I, years later, because I grew up with this love-hate relationship with that name. But when I looked it up, I found out that the Woolfolks came over around the same time that George Washington came over. They were actually next door neighbors or something like that. And there was actually a Woolfolk that married one of George Washington's kin. I don't think we got any George Washington blood in there. I guess I'll have to look and see. But my great-grandmother told me that you're part black, you're part Cherokee, and you're part white. She said, always be proud of being both black and Cherokee, and she said, but the white blood don't count. And so, and many years later, in thinking about her, and for some of the people who knew my family, the one, I think, bit of praise that I was honored to get from folks is when they said, sometimes you remind me of your great-grandma Frances.
Well, Ben, what I got out of your book, one is you got to be a really good listener, and two is maybe we ought to all go back and look at our ancestry, because I haven't looked back to mine very far. My only claim to fame is that my great uncle Albert Farr designed this building.
All right.
So, but what I as a Peace Corps volunteer, you're a minority in another land, and you're speaking a foreign language. Listening to a foreign language, you really have to be a good listener. And I told folks, I tell young people all the time when they go into politics, I said, well, you better be a good listener, because although people expect you to talk, if you don't listen, you're not going to say something intelligent. And what I learned from representing the military here, all of discovering that we actually had 14 military missions here, and thinking about growing up here on the Monterey Peninsula and what really makes this place so special. And in politics, it takes you to every nook and cranny. And then people talk about, we had the most beautiful place in the world to live. It's all about scenery. And I said, it's the most beautiful place to live because it's got the most wonderful people living here. But when you think about it, with this scenery, why wasn't the Monterey Peninsula a bunch of gated white communities? Why wasn't the Pebble Beaches all over Carmel Valley and up and through Seaside, Marina, and all the places? And I attribute that to the military. We had the largest military training base here in 1947 when President Truman integrated the military. And so we had a lot of minority interests living on that base. My dad was the first lawyer in Seaside, and he told me that a lot of his cases were essentially black enlisted folks coming to him and saying, you know, when I was stationed in Europe or in Southeast Asia, I married a Native woman from those countries, and now I'm back here on Fort Ord, and my commanding officer is sending me back to Louisiana, Mississippi, these states where my mixed marriage is illegal. And can you keep me here? And I asked my dad, I said, what do you do? That's not really a legal problem. He said, I just call the commanding general and tell him what the problem is, and they would settle it. But what I thought about that is that then the DLI came here, the Defense Language Institute really is the Army Language School in 1950, and brought in all these foreign linguists. They had to be host country nationals in order to teach the native language, about 22 different languages being taught here. And then the Navy came in and took over the old Del Monte Hotel and turned it into a graduate school, postgraduate school, where you got master's degrees and PhDs. But looking back on it, I think, but for the military, we would have been a bunch of white locked communities. But they integrated us, they diversified us, and they showed us that we could educate ourselves. And I think that was the people of this region, of this Bay Area, are the most diverse for population, for size, one of the most diversified and integrated populations anywhere in the country. And we're very fortunate to have that, and obviously very fortunate to have our own Ben Jealous here so he can lead the world. I just want to say, I think he really is in that responsibility now as head of the Sierra Club, because if you look at global warming, our biggest global problem, it was created essentially by the northern hemispheres. They're pretty white, and yet the solution has got to be to integrate the solution for both the southern and northern hemispheres. So somebody's got to be able to, as in your book, bring all these sides together. We're all on that bridge together. And I think Ben's the one that's going to lead us figuring it out.
But again, this, about not to take up all of your time, but this whole thing about, common interests and common good, I mean, that's one of the threads that goes through this book, and there's so many lessons in here. I really want you to read every page really thoroughly. Ben did a good job, a great job actually, capturing that essence. And if we can take something out of that book, it would be, I think that would be one of the things. There are obviously a number of things that we can take from this book that we could put into practice every day of our lives. The thing about race was also really good. Ben, you did a really great job on that, in terms of taking us back to where the word actually came from, Raza, I think is R-E-Z-Z-A. At that time, it didn't have the kind of meaning that race has now.
It's tribe or nation.
Right, absolutely, And so, but the bottom line is that, we all come from the same progenitor, if that's the right word I'm using. And we have to, really take a look at what is, when you make the point of, we not only incarcerate more black people than anywhere in the world, we also incarcerate more whites, especially more white men than anywhere in the world. And that's another statistic that people don't quite either see or get. And so it gives this false impression.
Well, and it's the poison in our politics. The poison in our politics right now is that America doesn't have a vision for allowing working class white men with no college degree to prosper. Because if you don't have a plan for them, you actually don't have a plan for anybody with no college degree to prosper. With women, with people of color, the Democrats can always lean on an anti-discrimination argument. Donald Trump at least showed he was willing to just parrot Bernie Sanders' talking points. Oh, I'll give you a better healthcare system. with no plan and no intention to follow through. And at any point, when you get to a place where basically most of your men, again, the white ones are real visible because you can't say it's racial this or it's gender that. It's just you have no plan for them. And you know, the black guys know that too, and the brown guys know that too, and white women with no college degree know that as well. And for a significant percentage of them, what's a bigger issue than being discriminated against is having a job to be discriminated against on. You know? And so whenever you get to that place in a society, Germany in the 30s, America today, it's a very volatile, dangerous place. It's part of why I'm excited to be at the Sierra Club, because the biggest investment we've seen in rebuilding the American economy since the Great Cities Program is this Inflation Reduction Act and the associated infrastructure bill. And the chance to actually manufacture here again and understand why we're doing it, which is you all will radically reduce, certainly, the carbon footprint of shipping everything in from China. But you also are creating, for the first time in American history, like ever, this country, our greatest subsidies were always our places and our people. In America, land of the virgin forests, the virgin streams from coast to coast, you were allowed to destroy any forest you wanted, any stream you wanted. Hell, if you're in West Virginia, you could blow up the whole damn mountain. It doesn't matter. And most people in America were treated as disposable too. All people of color and most white people. And most white people. Don't agree with me, go ask Aaron Brockovich. And so, or any labor leader, or just read history. And so, that is the old way of doing things, and that's what Sam's talking about as far as sort of like a colonial kind of view of the world taken to like, the 12th power. But for the first time, we have a major investment in actually building an economy where we can create jobs to help sustain the planet rather than destroy it. And we have a choice because it's all it's federal trillion seeding it to insist that those jobs are union jobs, they're good paying jobs, they're jobs that you can actually build a family on. So this is a big deal. And that's why I'm at Sierra Club right now, is because I believe we're on the cusp of something really, really big. But in that moment, we have to recognize what Dr. King was trying to teach us, and I started on this earlier, which is that why, you have to ask yourself why would they bother kind of 100 years after 1619 changing the definition of the word race to define people of African descent as subhuman? How do colonies survive? How do colonies thrive? Divide and conquer. Race is not just the boot on people of color's neck. It is that. Race is also the wedge driven by colonial overlords to divide the colony so they could continue to extract great wealth from the many to enrich the few. And what Dr. King was trying to get people to understand, the context of the Poor People's Campaign, what Fred Hampton, the Black Panthers in Chicago, were trying to get folks to understand in partnering with the Young Patriots, their white counterparts, was that everybody who gets divided gets hurt. Right. Everybody who gets divided gets hurt. And when there are 8 million and change black folks in poverty, 16 million and change white folks in poverty, and the point of dividing and conquering was to maintain mass poverty in order to allow a few people to be very rich. You can argue that more white folks get hurt by the division than blacks. But you also can be forgiven if you don't understand that, because the newspaper has not showed images of the white poor with any consistency since before the Civil Rights Movement. It's a game, and it's being run on all of us. And that's what Dr. King, that's what made him so dangerous. Was at the Poor People's Campaign had made it to Washington. They planned to shut down the nation's capital so thoroughly that the minimum amount of time Dr. King would have spent in prison would have been 5 years. And a man who's willing to go to those ends to show all of us the game that was being run on all of us was the most dangerous man in the country, according to the FBI. But there's opportunities, guys, every day to recreate this country. Are there any questions? Let's just kind of dive in. Yes, ma'am, in the back in the lavender.
When are you going to run for president?
No, I'm just focused on leading the Sierra Club. And I'm having a ball doing it. I had the opportunity to be governor this year, and I say that without any bragging. It's just true. If you can count votes. And a dear friend of mine, a guy who in Baltimore, there's 5 black men whose families are from Baltimore, who live around Baltimore, who are all former Rhodes Scholars. I'm 3rd in the birth order, and my friend is 4th, and he called me 2 years ago. And he said, "Are you going to run for governor?" And I said, my kids need me at home right now. And I told them just this morning that if you don't run, I will, because there's this other guy who I think is, excuse me, but a complete douchebag. And I was like, there's no way. There's no way I'm going to step aside for him to be governor. And he said, I said, "So what are you going to do?" He said, "Well, I just told my wife the same thing. I'm not running if you're running." He said, "So what are you going to do?" I said, "Well, you're running." He said, "How do you figure?" I said, "Because wife trumps kids. I'm a single dad. Your kids will be just fine if you run once and win. If I run for a second time and win," I said, "what keeps coming to my mind, it was real, it wasn't a joke, was Jeb Bush, who ran and lost, and then he ran and won, and his daughter spent famously years and years in rehab and struggling with it. And my parents are both therapists, as many of you know in this town, and my mom said to me once in a fit of candor, it's not a question of, or maybe it was my dad, I forget, one of them did, but again, it's not a matter of if you fuck up your kids. Like, if you will fuck up your kids, it's only a question of how much are you willing to. And that's a daily calculation, and that day I was clear. It wasn't worth the risk. Well, his name is Wes Moore, and he's now governor. And we did something in that race I don't think 2 black men have ever done before, and I only say this because it's not the stereotype of our community, it was the myth. Myself and Lieutenant Governor Anthony Brown, the 2 last Democratic nominees for governor of Maryland, we got together with him when he was 4th, which is where I had started out in the primary. And this year I was polling 1st. And I said, and we just laid out, this is how you win the primary. But I say that to say that I have these last 2 months traveling around this country with the Sierra Club. I did a listening tour before taking over 2 weeks ago. It has me more excited about the possibilities for this country, and very excited about the prospects of a green movement that shows up for the first time not just with sticks, but with carrots. Shows up as people planting seeds for a brand new economy. It's a very powerful place to be. And what I'm focused on right now is getting an army of advisors out there for municipalities in red states. The red state governments won't talk to us. So we're going after the places that will in their cities, a lot of big counties, places like Houston. And for the states that will work with us, we're sending out advisors to the states to help them understand this is how you get the money to convert your buses to all electric. This is how you get the money to bring a new factory to your town. And it's the last part that excites me the most. I was the spokesman for the Student Environmental Action Coalition in 1993 against NAFTA. They called me Chicken Little. Everything we said would happen happened. 63,000 American factories shut down. Every single one of those places, the opioid addictions went up. Every single one of those places, the suicide rate up. Pretty much the homicide rate went up every place too. And I think the green movement right now is our best hope for building consensus across party lines to rebuild this country. Yes, sir. Derek.
Ben, excuse me, long question, and it's not so organizational or
Join the crowd.
political. Right. Looking at the book, I'm talking and listening to a man who can be considered othered by standards of America from racism. You're other. You're talking to us rather, about your family, slave ownership, and all these different moves. the story of you and Dave Chappelle, don't tell anybody about this real soon, the whole idea, all of this, but yet the book, from what I understand, have not read it, comes to an end where we're talking about unity and collaboration and that sort of thing. But the title says, Our People Were Always Free. So it really sounds like it is one-sided, but the book comes from the side. Where did you get the title? How and why?
Sure, yeah. So in Virginia, where my people are from, the definition of black was 1/32 African descent. In Alabama, it was one known ancestor of African descent, one known ancestor of African. There was a white guy who was, I think, about 64th African, who was put into prison in the 50s for marrying a white woman. Because I guess he pissed off the wrong guy and went to the court and said, well, you know, way back, he descends from this one slave. And so they made him black.
He kept good records.
Yeah. You know, you could go to a poor town in Alabama, they don't even need records, it's just memory. Nothing changes. Which is just to say, Derek, like that's the only definition that we have for black and white. We're horrible laws. And it just is what it is. The, you know, the title came from something that my grandmother would say when we got into those uncomfortable conversations about what we were just talking about. All of it. Jeffersonian model of blackness. You know, why are we black? All that stuff. And she would just, if she got frustrated, if she got tired, if she just wanted to shift the conversation, she would say, never forget our people were always free. It made my brain hurt when I was a kid. I was a real logical kid. This did not make any sense. And then when I was a teenager, I had all kinds of privileges because I was the baby, because I was the boy, all of that. Because I was the grandkid who went there the most, all of that. So I just said to her flat out, what are you talking about? 3 of your 4 grandparents were born into slavery. 1 your own sister says was a rapist. Was it the rapist that was free, Grandma? As far as I tell, he should be in prison. She says, well, your grandfather, I said, and then she just looked at me like she either thought I was an idiot or something much worse, and she just walked away. And that's why, you know, so that's why experience with Mel experience Mel had at the Village Project in Seaside was so instructive to me. Because here my mom occasionally would say, well, my grandmother would say, my sister would repeat it at college parties, never forget our people were always free. Our people are always free. My grandmother said that her mother said it, that her mother said it. Didn't make any sense for any of them either. But Mel had an experience with a white guy who walked into the Village Project in Seaside seeking mental health, who insisted he was white. He kept cussing at Mel in something that, just white. No, I'm just white. I'm just white. I'm just white. No culture. Right? No anything, just white. I mean, he kept cussing at Mel in a foreign language. He insisted it wasn't a foreign language. But it was. And Mel had spent time in Ireland and recognized it for what it was, which was kiss my ass in Old Irish. And the guy didn't know that, and Mel informed him of it. And it changed the guy's whole life. But what it taught me was that people can repeat things down, say, a paternal line or a maternal line without understanding so thoroughly that they don't just forget who first said it, where it come from, but that they're even speaking a different language. The guy thought it was just a sound the men in his family made when they were upset and he stomped their foot. And so I went to Henry Louis Gates Jr. and I asked for help. Said, you know, I went to African Ancestry and they say that our X chromosome is Asian and they can't help us. They also said that that usually means you're Native American. So, Skip, I just need your help finding it. So, Ben, it'll take 6 months. I'll figure out what tribe you come from. 2 years later, he hasn't called me. So I call him like, yo, I know I'm no longer president of the NAACP. Maybe your producer doesn't want me on your show. It's real cool. You have my DNA. That's my property. Give it back. Tell me where it's from. And he says, no. It took me until last week. You're on the show next month. Let's sit down. And what we were trying to figure out was, when did this saying make sense? How far back do we have to go on the maternity? And the obvious answer is, it made sense for the first woman in that family line to set foot in America, because she would have been brought here as a slave. And what we figured out was that we descend from the Polynesian founders of Madagascar. That our Asian chromosome goes to Indonesia, to Polynesia, to Madagascar, to here. Only 17 slave ships were ever brought here. By the way, my daughter was devastated by all this, because it meant that we did not descend from Pocahontas like great-grandma said. But she was much relieved when I came back and said, baby, no, we are not Indians, we're not Native Americans, we are pirates. The Madagascar slave trade was a pirate slave trade, it was a rogue slave trade, it was an irregular slave trade. Only 17 ships ever showed up to what is now the United States from Madagascar with human cargo and their bellies. 16 out of 17 were piloted by known European pirates. It was the product of a more than century-long war between African pirates and European pirates. And when the Africans would lose, they would enslave the able-bodied people and ship them. And well, what would a pirate woman say to her children and grandchildren born into slavery? But never forget our people were always free. And how would she say it? Maybe as a call to insurrection. Certainly as a call to dignity. And absolutely as a way of planting a seed in that child's mind to be handed down to the next generation, that freedom had to be our destiny, because it had always been our history. And so the women in the family, as far as I can tell, right down to my sister, repeated it because of how it made them feel, even if they didn't quite understand it. And those women on that branch are, I would say, more rebellious than most women or men in the family, including your friend, my mom, who sued her high school as a named plaintiff in the desegregation lawsuit against her high school when she was 12. So she could desegregate when she was 15. And then they said that the principal said, this school will be desegregated over my dead body. And she died my mom's junior year. I'm not saying mom had anything to do with it, other than startling her in the hallway. So, are there any other questions?
Can you speak a little louder?
Oh, sure. I can stand up. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Yes, and we've heard a lot tonight about the racial groups that are here. How about the Spanish-speaking immigrant inflow, that population? How would your message be altered to include them?
Oh,
Speak to them?
so, yeah, I mean, this is the story, if you will, of me and my family. So there's no altering it, right? Any more than, I would ask, I don't know, Nabokov not to write about Russians, Now, as far as the conversation in our country, it's the same conversation. What we're talking about is the conversation about ultimately moving beyond the dividing lines of colonialism. That's what we're talking about. And so, in the context of the American South, it's a black and white divide. And it's, and there are subtleties within that. There were Native American tribes that were called civilized because they owned slaves. And those are some of the hardest wounds to heal in the South. But the big one was black and white, and I would say, there's a reason why Monterey County is one of, I think, 5 counties in the country that was included in the Voting Rights Act, along with the former slave states. And it's because discrimination against Chicanos in this county is similar in its ruthlessness when it came to politics to discrimination against blacks in Mississippi. It's all there. And I discuss some of that in the book, actually. This town that we're in, there's a lot of trauma in this town. I think finally we have that mural on the bike path that speaks to some of it. But as a kid, I ran into it because I went looking for ghost stories in the 3rd grade in Pacific Grove. And every ghost story had to do ultimately with the Chinese village that was burned down, the Native American village that was decimated with smallpox, with the Spanish colonial government and the War of 1848, here, and so on. So, yeah, you don't have to go very far, it's true.
One of the things I've tried to do with the Hispanic population here is remind them that, this county is where California, Western United States was born, right here in Monterey. And when you think that the Padres with the Spaniards landed here in 1770, I think the first Anglo that came here was in the 1830s. So it was almost 60 years where there wasn't a single word of English spoken here. And out of those 60 years was the birth of government, the birth of trade. I mean, we never give the Hispanic history of this area the credit it deserves. But for this, Monterey, I mean, everything that is great at California now had its seeds right here in our backyard. First trial by jury, first public education, first newspaper, first theater, and it goes on and on. First piano in the Western United States, music, everything. It all was born right here. So, and the Spaniards and Mexicans were here before we were.
And I think also, and certainly, from the perspective of black people, we've had some really good discussions with our Latinx sisters and brothers who are coming here from, especially Mexico. The last governor of California, when California was still part of Mexico before this country stole it, was a man named Pio Pico. And Pio Pico was of African descent. The second president of Mexico, Vicente Guerrero, was of African descent. Emiliano Zapata, the great revolutionary, was of Mexican descent. I'm sorry, I forget what he's Mexican too, but he's, thank you, brother. And then there's one other that's coming to mind and stuff, but anyway, we have those kind of common histories, and that we need to be able to talk about them. Jose Morelos, who was Vicente Guerrero's second in command in the War of Independence against Spain, was also of African descent. And if you look at the map in Mexico, there are two states that are right next to each other, Guerrero and Morelos, are named after these two brothers. And those two states are together like that. Many people that I've talked to didn't know that. They knew that there was somebody named Vicente Guerrero and Jose Morelos and Pio Pico, but they didn't know that they were also of African ancestry. And so, and sometimes we can just, if we study history, we can find all kinds of commonalities that we can use to talk to almost anybody, or probably anybody. But that's what we have to do. And so that always ended up being a good starting point for us, and then we broadened it from there to say that there are all kinds of people here who have all kinds of heritages, and just like we had those heritages to bring us together, there are all kinds of other heritages that can do the same thing. But we have to be able to talk, and we have to be able to speak to each other. And if we have that knowledge, then we have to have the courage, right, to step forward and say, this is who I am, this is what I know, and this is why I want to talk with you, because I want us to be like this instead of like this.
Ben, I have a question. As the publisher of the Pacific Grove Press,
Yes.
one of the most contentious issues in the city, that I get more letters to the editor than anything else, is the issue of the DEI, the diversity, equity, inclusion. And so how on a practical level, with you guys up here, if you guys can address the community using your book as an example.
Is this in the context of education, or?
This is say that again? It's a city committee
Gotcha.
that's set up, and so more than any other issue since I've been publisher, has been the issue of diversity. And so if you're talking on people got massacred and they were able to work together. What on a practical level, can we, as a community here, figure out a way of going forward?
I definitely recommend just skipping past massacre. No, I mean, look, a couple things. One, keep a couple of. In order to maintain your hope, just gotta talk about mindset, and then we'll talk about it. Right? In order to maintain your hope, about this country, because what you're describing here is happening all over the country, right? You gotta, I think, first just recognize a couple of things. One is that American centuries invariably end better than they start out. Happened in the 20th century, happened in the 19th century, happened in the 18th century. 17th century is a little murky, but it certainly goes through. And I think it's likely to happen here. But if we went back 100 years from right now, as far as race relations in America, we'd be like a year or so after Red Summer, where they massacred the black soldiers returning from World War I, and the year before Black Wall Street in Tulsa, where they innovated a new type of race riot, where they flew in the planes that would normally put out fires. They filled the buckets with tar and oil to accelerate the fires and destroy the wealthiest black business center in the country. So 100 years ago, things were looking pretty hopeless. But at the end of the century, things were much better. I think we're headed that way now. This is the century when white people become minorities too. Everybody. What I love is the phrase when they say, oh, it'll be a majority-minority nation. It just hurts, makes my head, it's like, no, we will all be minorities. And there's a lot of white folks, most in this room certainly, my dad absolutely, like, hooray, finally my people have to get along with other people. That's awesome. My kindergarten teacher told me that. She was right. So, what it's going to mean is that white folks will have to get along with other groups demographically to exceed democratically. And that's the world that most folks live in this country. And that's the place we will all be. So there are a lot of white folks who are like, hooray. There are other people, you don't even have to be racist to be scared by change. There are people who are just scared by change. And American politics have had a hell of a lot of change in my lifetime. I was born in 73. In 76, white men decided who was the American president. In 1980, white men decided who was the American president. By 84, you had to have women. By 92, you had to have black folks. By 2016, you had to have Muslims in Michigan. By 2020, you better have Venezuelans in southern Florida. It's a whole lot of change. And again, you don't have to be racist to be scared by change. But you better believe that people will fight when they feel backed into a corner in a vicious way. And my grandmother, farm girl that she was, when you are talking about racists, like people who are really fixated, people who use rhetoric the way Donald Trump does to divide people and denigrate people. People like DeSantis who decide, rather than fix your damn schools because the effectiveness by grade level goes off a cliff in Florida. They like to talk about the really good in the first grade, the really good in college. College is propped up by kids from out of state, and like the first grade is the last grade that they do a good job for kids in Florida. And it just goes like this, right? Rather than that, no, he wants to ban teaching black history, right? He's what you call a strategic racist, I would say, like George Wallace. He knows better. He's a very well-educated guy. He was in the military. He knows better than this. But he's decided this is how you become president. And so folks like that who are fighting viciously right now understand they are like a fox. They are meek and mild until they're backed into a corner and then they're vicious. But what the farmer knows is that the fox is the most vicious when the fox understands everything's about to change in a way the fox cannot control. And so we have to, I think, show empathy with folks, listen to folks, and shift them bit by bit away from fear and towards courage. You know, I learned that in this town. There was a guy named Howard who lived up the street from me. You remember Howard, Alex? Howard was scary to us. Howard was 4 or 5 years older, and one day myself and another black kid from PG Middle were walking past Howard's Chevy up on blocks. And we lingered too long looking at his Chevy. Now, we were like 12, so we definitely couldn't drive. And it was on blocks, so how would you steal it? But he grabbed grabs some nunchucks and he chases down the hill and around the corner. And I called my grandma and I told her what happened. We call her every Saturday or Sunday. And she said, "Oh, baby, just feel sorry for him. Imagine what it's like to walk around with all that hate in your heart all the time." She said, "Baby, for some people, just having to be themselves is punishment enough." And, and you see that when you look at how Lee Atwater felt about himself, the architect of the Southern Campaign, at the end of his life. When you look at the way that George Wallace felt about himself at the end of his life, you know who who I think died proud of who he was? Jack Kemp. Jack Kemp, who I had seen, and it's in the book, in LA, campaigning for better education for black kids in a way that made black women wonder where he was from, because he kept talking about our kids and they didn't understand. There's this white guy, let alone Republican, on fire talking about their kids as our kids, because they were all American kids. And Jack Kemp, who when he ran for president, they cornered him and they said, because they had gotten Dukakis on being a card-carrying member of the ACLU, our local NAACP president here, longstanding. You might recall when they got to Jack Kemp, they said, "How can you be running for president as a card-carrying member of the GOP and the NAACP?" And Jack Kemp said, "I never thought about that before, but now that I do, I've never had a problem fighting for the rights of men I used to shower with every day." Because he had been a quarterback in the NFL when it desegregated. And so, I'm hopeful about where we get to. It's going to be hard. But I'm telling you, as much as you may want to block friends from your Facebook page and forget about it, go sit with those friends you're struggling with those family members that you're struggling with. And what you find every time, because I've done it, is they're the same person that you thought that they were before you read their Facebook page that day. They still are. People lose their mind on social media. They're probably a little bit more isolated than you remember, especially if they're a guy. We get more and more isolated the older that we get. And if you just listen to them, you'll be reminded you have way more in common than you don't. And for me, every time as president of the NAACP, I needed to perform a miracle. The miracle was possible because I followed that, the highest level in this country. Just go sit with them, explain your case, listen to them, and by the end, you will either figure out that you agree on something that's going to help you with that situation, or something else that's going to help you a year from now, and you just don't know yet. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder if you could take that a little bit further, because I think you're getting at kind of reconciliation at an individual level, but we're starting to see more attempts at reconciliation at least the state level here in California. I wonder if you can speak to that sort of collective effort at reconciliation, and also might be a little bit leading, speak to it in your role as executive director of the Sierra Club, knowing what role the environment has in healing people.
Yeah, sure. Sure. Well, it's interesting, right? I teach leadership at the University of Pennsylvania. And I tell, a lot of my theory for how you succeed is you've got to have courage. And a lot of folks don't feel like, for whatever reason, this trauma, didn't have this experience, that experience, this protected parent, that protected parent, they feel like they haven't cultivated their courage enough to achieve the dreams that keep coming to them. And so I say, look, the easiest way to do that is you got to start regularly spending more and more time in the woods or more and more time on the water. Because if you're in a little craft on the water, you can drown like that. And if you're in the woods and you get lost and you panic, you can die a quarter mile from the road of exposure. What leadership requires in each of us is the ability to get calm right when everybody else is reasonably freaking out. And that's what being in the wild teaches you. Now, I believe a couple things about sort of reconciliation on the sort of the state level, right? One is baseline. We have to have children reading the truth, like baseline. And if we're not doing that, we're really in trouble. Next thing I would say is, if we're talking about reparation or dealing with specific harm longstanding, the more specific we can be, the closer to the ground we are, the easier it is to deal with, the less debatable it is. Nobody has an issue. I mean, at Fox News, nobody has an issue about reparation for the families whose ancestors were sold by Georgetown University to keep the school from being bankrupt into slavery in ostensibly worse situations. It's very specific. And how one group benefited and one group was harmed is very clear. And there's a lot of that to be done. In a place like this, you know, the conversation about Feast of Lanterns, for instance, and burning of the Chinese village, and all of that, those are things that we need to talk about, that we need to understand. And it's not to pretend like anybody who's alive today is responsible for what happened back then. But it is to say that the trauma and the patterns absolutely were established by, and there are many such things that happen here. So that's what I say, is we start with the truth, we get as specific as possible, because the actual history matters. And then we do what I'm encouraging people to do one-on-one, which is you cultivate the courage it takes just to listen without judgment to somebody else who you know is starting off in a place that, at least from what you know, is very different from yours. What happens as you listen is you come closer and closer together. At the very least, as my grandmother would say, we know that we're both human. Yes, ma'am, in the back. Oh, it's impossible to hear you. I'm sorry.
I want to go back to what the gentleman was saying about the diversity, equity, and inclusion thing, because I find the terms very ephemeral, and I want to know what that looks like.
Yeah.
What does that mean? You know, it's really simple to say, like.
Let me tell you how to basically, a little bit of a different way, because without knowing the specifics of what's happening in town, it's real, you know, it's impossible. The couple things, you know, one was like, what's the goal? I think the goal was actually laid out a long time ago by Frederick Douglass in his in his tirade against the Chinese Exclusion Act. Frederick Douglass, in his tirade against the Chinese Exclusion Act, said, you know, he got down to the end of it. He was saying that every nation has a unique mission, a unique destiny. And then he reasons, and I'm going to paraphrase because 19th century orators talk like the King James Bible reads. And so he says, you know, every nation has a unique mission, a unique destiny, that its destiny is ultimately defined by its character being that nation at its best, not its worst, and is shaped by its geography. And then he reasons that America, our destiny, defined by our character at our best, not our worst, which is a lot for a man who'd been held and tortured as a slave to say. And shaped by our world-connecting geography. Two oceans, east and west, connect to everybody on the planet. Two nations, north and south, he describes different colors, border us, friendly nations. He says that is to be, quote, our mission, our destiny is to be, quote, the most perfect example of the unity and dignity of the human family that the world has ever seen. The most perfect example of the unity and dignity of the human family the world has. That's what we're trying to get to, right? Like, what does it look like? That's what it looks like. How do we get there? A couple of things I would say. This is how, and I've done this with me, it was typically head of the NAACP dealing with the CEO of a corporation that, for example, had a good history of promoting women and people of color, but it wasn't clear that this person was committed to it, right? So they may think like some legacy Fortune 100 company. And what I would say to the CEO is a few things. One, if you become a champion for women's equality, if you become a champion for racial inclusion, brother, you'll be more interesting to yourself. I guarantee you. What I knew is this: we're American men. Let me show you this how it goes for American men. Raise your hand if you've noticed, men or women, raise your hand if you've noticed, as you've aged, I just turned 50, I can do this. No, AARP, please call them and tell them that. Raise your hand if you've noticed as you've aged that in general, the couples that you know, the wives get more and more interesting and the husbands don't. All right? And so what's going on? Well, women's social networks on average expand until 10 years before death, and men's on average shrink from the last year of formal education. So if you're sitting with a corporate CEO, the chances that he's socially isolated, with that gender dynamic, and then everything that wealth does for you, is through the roof high. So you can get him laughing by saying, brother, I guarantee you, you will be more interesting to yourself. You'll be invited to better parties. And when you get to the country club, you'll have way better stories than anybody else. Because they're still talking about high school. And you were hanging out with a bunch of black engineers. And it turned out the party was way better than the white engineers party. And you know because you were there as a friend. And it's a lot like mentoring in other ways. Like, I mean, how many people mentor some young person? You find out you're getting more of it than they are. But their mom says, well, that's okay, because what they get from you, they can't get from anybody else. And then they say, well, how do I do that? And then it's something I got from my dad. So how do you do that? I said, first of all, if you're about to say something or do something, and you think this is what a good missionary would say or do, don't do it. People aren't here for your advice. No, I want you to think with honesty about how you got to where you are. Because I sit on company boards. And I've been in the conversation where the CEO blew $30 million of advertising spend thinking they knew better than the marketing firm. And just burned up $30 million. And you know what happens? The chairman that backs that CEO listens to all the board members who are rightfully ticked and then says, yes, but consider the educational value. Knowing what he knows now, is he not more valuable to us than anybody else we can find like that? In other words, what women need from men in the workplace, what people of color need from white folks in the work, is to back us. And you know what it's like to be backed. Don't give people a shot. You know what the phrase for that is in Mississippi? Give the boy all he needs to hang himself. Give the boy all the rope he needs to hang himself. No. Back him like you do the friend of your son from the country club. All right, who gets drunk, who shows up late, who gets 3 chances and then 3 more, and then one day it clicks. That's all that people need. So I would say, what does the goal look like? It looks like that rainbow that Frederick Douglass talked about. Dignity and unity being the key words. And how do we get there? People have to shift their mindset, realize that this is as transformative for them as it is for anybody else. They may get more out of it. And then literally do for others what was done for them. And the middle is what I refer to as enlightened narcissism. Right? In college, the black professors were more interested in me than they were white kids. And the white professors were more interested in the white kids than they were in me. And there were a lot more white professors than black professors, but the pattern was similar. And what it came down to is this, is people would like see a kid and they'd be like, oh, that kid reminds me of me when I was, right? That is shallow narcissism. Because any of us, if I said to you, what are you most proud of about you? You wouldn't say my eye color, my hair color, my skin color, the shape of my nose. No, you would say my character, my grit, my creativity, my genius, whatever, right? But you got to look past somebody else being black or somebody else being white or somebody else being whatever you are. Doesn't equate with any of those things. So it's the enlightened narcissist who says, I'm looking for somebody who has the stuff inside that I have inside. You put those three things together, you can do a whole lot of good.
I'm really intrigued by the conversation you're having about the ability to listen and the combination of listening with courage. Big ideas are great and inspirational. And in the small idea, the power of small conversation, to small connections, you could talk to that. Because changing the world from the line at Costco, I believe is possible if we want to step into conversations with the people that are around us.
100%, and we're going to look to be the last question. I realize that we're 10 minutes over, and I promised to sign 7 books. So, yes, what I would say is this. As I step into as president of the Sierra Club, there's 2 things that I'm thankful for. One was that when I was president of the NAACP started climate justice committees in all of its chapters with the intention of working with Sierra Club on the ground, and that excites me. But the other thing is this. When I was president of the NAACP, I asked the head of the Sierra Club to pass policy supporting voting rights for the first time in what was then their 120-year history. And he said, Ben, what do I say to my board? We didn't do that for women's rights. We didn't do it in '65. Why would we do it now? And I said to him, well, Van Jones is out there screaming, there is no green vote without the black or brown vote. Maybe y'all should reverse engineer, because I think the Koch brothers have. The Koch brothers make their money destroying the planet, and they know that the #1 group to support environmental regulation is Latinos, and the #2 group is blacks. And whose voting rights are they going after, right? And he was like, oh. And he went and he did that. But why were we able to have that conversation with such trust? Because we've been part of a leadership group for a year before that. Every 3 months got CEOs together, major advocacy groups. And like half of it was work and half of it was like, again, like drinking brown liquor by the fire, you know? And we got to really know each other, and there was trust and there was comfort and there was respect there. And that works on the community level too. And so yeah, I think the Costco line, the Walmart line, whatever it is, when you listen to folks, you don't know where it's going to lead you. But invariably, you're important in your community in some way. You're somebody's dad, you're some school's alum, whatever it is. And at some point, you're going to be called to a moment of courage where you have to get something done. And the more friends you have, the more people whose values you understand, the more options you have in a democracy for actually getting that done. And so that's the value of listening. And that's honestly what I learned here. The hardest thing leaving Pacific Grove was showing up in New York City, where like you walk in and say, hi, people are like, but I never quite let them beat that out of me. I still wanted to say hi. Thank you very much.